Hello, I welcome you to the Psychology of Global Crisis Conference hosted by the American University of Paris. This is the keynote address of Professor Bill Hirst. Bill Hirst is the Malcolm B. Smith Chair and Professor of Psychology at the New School for Social Research in New York City. I am Maria Medved, Professor of Psychology at the American University of Paris, and one of the co-organizers of this event. I will be moderating this session. Before I continue, I would like to add that I'm especially thrilled to be here today, as I was a postdoctoral student working with Bill many moons ago. One of the reasons that I went to go work with Bill is he's one of those rare scholars whose program of work dissolves the borders between quantitative and qualitative approaches, and between even cognitive neuroscience and collective sociological processes. Among his many interests, an area of focus has been looking at the social aspects of cognition and memory. He has published on topics ranging from the cultural and social influences of memories of 9/11, remembering in people with amnesia, to how families share memories. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Bill Hirst, giving his talk entitled Remembering Crises, the Problem of Intergenerational Forgetting.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for the organizers in putting together this incredible undertaking. As Maria said, I'm going to talk a little bit about remembering crisis, but in particular a particular crisis that is COVID-19. Now, because COVID-19 has spread across the world, and because one country after another has shut down, and because unemployment soars for over 20%, and because an economic depression looms, people opine that we'll never forget COVID-19. In other words, it has become a permanent fixture in our memory. But in order to unpack that, you really have to think about different acts of remembering. There's memory of the individual who lived through the pandemic will have of the pandemic. And then there is its legacy, the memory future generations will have. I want to consider both forms of remembering. What we, the people that have lived through the pandemic, remember about its years in the years to come, and how future generations may remember it. Will it eventually be forgotten? My concern here is both with individual and collective memories. I probably don't need to say much about individual memories, but in terms of collective memories, they were originally studied by Maurice Halbwachs. There are many different ways of defining collective memory. Here I'll treat it as individual memories shared across a community that bears on the community's collective identity. And I should caution that it's not just enough for a memory to be shared. It must bear on the collective memory. So all Spaniards have a memory of the value of pi, or most Spaniards do, but that doesn't make it a Spanish collective memory. The Madrid bombing, on the other hand, is a Spanish collective memory because it bears on Spain's identity, Spaniards' identity. Now, as I said, I want to explore the various acts of remembering, because I do, I need to make some distinctions clear from the very beginning. The first distinction I want to make is between what I call lived and distant memories, or both individual and collective memories, but mainly collective memories. Collective memories can be about events that occurred during one's lifetime, that they would be lived collective memories. You don't need to necessarily experience them directly. I wasn't at ground zero at the time it occurred, but and neither were most Americans, but I think you could say that they have a lived collective memory of that experience. With COVID-19, for us, we who have lived through it, it's become a lived collective memory. It's been incorporated into our community identity, and all of us clearly at the present moment have memories of it unfolding. But many collective memories also involve events that occurred
Bill,
before one was, yeah,
Bill, can I just interrupt? Are you showing slides?
I am.
Because I don't see them. Can you just give it a shot?
Yeah, let's see if I
And
can.
if it doesn't work, we'll just continue on. 'Cause it's
I
actually
may have
flowing
to,
really
yeah, I
well.
may have, um, uh, here. How's that?
Yeah, just put it on slideshow. It's perfect.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, everyone. I'm technologically challenged. Does that work?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Hopefully you understood what I was saying up till now. So I'm talking about distinctions. I talked about the distinctions between lived and distant collective memories. And I now want to turn to the distinction between cultural and communicative memories. Cultural memories are captured by cultural artifacts, the books, the museums, the movies, the commemorations that any society has about their past. Communicative memories are memories that are transmitted interpersonally. Osman says that they are ordinary memories, the memories that make up our daily lives. Importantly, communicative memories have a very short temporal horizon. Osman speculated that they can last about 100 years, 2 or 3 generations. So I may know something about my parents' life. I may know a little bit about my grandparents' life. But if you ask me about my great-great-grandmother's life, I'd have absolutely nothing to say. Cultural memories are on the other hand, have a very long temporal horizon. And indeed, they are the ones that sort of form a collective identity that spans multiple generations. So a society needs to form collective memories, the claim is, if they are to have, if the past is going to impact on their identity, especially the distant past. So returning to the question, will we remember COVID-19? We clearly have lived collective memories of COVID-19. Some of them are personal. It's not me, but somebody might decide to take up baking again, and they may remember back to that great apple pie they made. And then there are collective memories of us all wearing face masks, keeping social distancing, and at least in my social circles, complaining about Trump and Bolsonaro. But we also have, at some point, these lived collective memories will become distant collective memories. Some of these distant collective memories will be communicative. There will be personal memories about how my parents or my grandchildren will remember how I lived through COVID-19. The personal stories, they may hear about the great apple pie I baked. And there will be factual memories about Trump and Bolsonaro's, for instance, way of responding to the pandemic. But we also might build culturally distant memories. There might be films, stories, monuments, memorials, and so on, something that I will get to toward the end of the talk. So I can reframe my concerns in, will people form and maintain over the long term lived personal collective memories of COVID-19? And what, if they do, what will their content be like? Will there be distant communicative memories of COVID-19? That is, will the next generation, the generation after that, remember the pandemic? And again, what will the content of these memories be like? And will distant cultural memories be formed of COVID-19? Will there be books, films, monuments, memorials? And this will be really necessary if we're going to preserve the pandemic over an extended period of time, our memories of the pandemic over an extended period of time. Let me start with the first question. Will people form and maintain over the long term lived personal and collective memories of COVID-19? What will their content be? Here, probably the best reference point is a substantial literature on flashbulb memories. Flashbulb memories were first studied by Brown and Kulik. They refer to the circumstances in which you learned of a public emotionally charged event. They don't refer to the memory for the public event itself. They refer to the personal details. That is, I remember where I was when I learned about the attack on the World Trade Center on September 11th. That's separate from the fact that I may know that there were 4 planes involved. So we can talk about memory for public details or event memories, and memory for personal details or flashbulb memories. The mapping here, I should say, is not perfect. I'll say this from the get-go. The personal memories when forms related to COVID-19 take place over time. Flashbulb memories usually refer to a single instance in which one learned of learns of what is usually a fairly severely temporally bounded event. Even though I think one can learn something from the studies of flashbulb memories. And here I'm going to spend some time talking about the 10-year longitudinal study of 9/11. And in this particular study, people were sampled across the United States within the first week. Then there was a 1-year later follow-up, a 3-year later follow-up with the same people, and then a 10-year later. So we tested the same people the first week, 1 year later, 3 years later, and 10 years later. We asked them questions about where they were when they learned about the attack, who they were with, what time it was, et cetera, those sorts of canonical features of an event. And then we also asked them what they knew about 9/11, how many planes there were, the crash site, where George Bush was at the time, and so on. What you find in this study, as well as other studies of flashbulb memories, is that flashbulb memories are very vivid, they're long-lasting, and they're confidently held. That is, these personal autobiographical memories of the way in which you learned about 9/11 last for at least the 10 years that we looked at. They're vivid and they're confidently held. People claim, indeed, that they will never forget them. And in a sense, I think they're right, in that they continue to have the memory. After 10 years, 99.5% of our participants reported a memory. And this includes even those who were 65 years of age at the time of the attack. In fact, they were an average of 71 years. So 10 years later, when they were 81 years or more, they still had a vivid, confidently held memory of 9/11. But in all instances, the memory was not accurate. Here, I'm measuring accuracy in terms of using their first memory, which we collected the first week after the attack, as sort of the baseline. So in a sense, we're really talking about consistency rather than accuracy. But the assumption is that the memory the first week is fairly accurate, and therefore you're getting some probe into accuracy. And what we found was that there was a 60% consistency after 1 year. That is, people were inconsistent 40% of the time, at least in some aspects of the memory. And after the first year, that sort of dramatic forgetting you saw asymptoted, leveled off, and you didn't see much more forgetting after that period. Now, these inconsistencies remain stable after the decline of the first year. So for instance, that is, people tended to repeat the same thing, even though it was not necessarily an accurate representation. So in one example, this individual reported that she was on the train going to work when she learned about the attack the first week. And then 1 year later, she remembered that she was at work. 3 years later, she remembered she was at work. And 10 years later, she was at work, when presumably where she really was on the train. Thus, it seems that people forget what they believe that they will never forget, and they remain absolutely confident that their memory is accurate, even though it isn't necessarily accurate. Now, flashbulb memories may be unique to the individual. They're autobiographical, so they're memories where I learned about it, which is not the same place as, not the same instance or event where you learned about it. But they are shared across the community in the sense that everybody within the community has them, and they are very community specific. So the French have flashbulb memories of the death of President Mitterrand. Black Americans have flashbulb memories of the assassination of Malcolm X, where white Americans do not. Brits have a flashbulb memories of the death of Princess Diana, whereas Italians do not. Even the content of flashbulb memories is community-based. So for instance, Danes of a certain age remember the weather when the Germans invaded as worse than it actually was, and they remember the weather as better than it actually was when the Germans withdrew. Now, flashbulb memories vary not only in terms of group membership, but they also vary to the extent to which one identifies with a group. And here I'm going to look at not flashbulb memories for important events that occur to the nation or the like, but I have a graduate student, Clint Merck, who is a big sports fan, and he wanted to look at flashbulb memories of sporting events, and in particular a hockey event. And he looked at fans of either fans of the winning and losing team. He measured the group identification, how much they identified with the team, and he also how much they thought the event was central to their identity as a fan. And he looked at two types of events, all within the same short time period. There was the conference championship. Hockey has an Eastern Conference and a Western Conference, and they both have their championships, and then the two winning teams get together for the big final tournament, which is called the Stanley Cup. And the conference championship was considered, and what he found was that conference championships were considered less central to the identity of the fan than the final tournament, though this was less pronounced for the team that lost the final tournament. So the final tournament is the big central event, but not as central for the losing team as it is for the winning team. And interestingly, he found that when event centrality was low, that is the conference final, group identification predicted not flashbulb memory consistency, but confidence. That is, the more you thought that you were identified with your team, the more you were confident in your memory of where you watched the game or where you learned about the game. And when event centrality was high, which was the final tournament, the Stanley Cup, it wasn't a group identification that was predictive of your confidence in your reception event. It was the event centrality. So as the event became more central, and remember, event centrality means the event is important to your identity. Somehow or other, this identification measure was tied to the specific event. Whereas the event became less central, it was tied more generally to your just identification with the group. What about memory for public details, the facts? I can return now to 9/11 study. Again, there's a sharp decline the first year, and then forgetting levels off. Now inaccuracies are not necessarily repeated, rather they're corrected. And I think they're corrected because there is media coverage of it. Media coverage doesn't really talk about how you learned about the event, but it does talk about the facts of the event in general. So we find that extended media coverage is correlated with accuracy of memory for public details. It's not correlated with memories for personal details. So Fahrenheit 9/11, Michael Moore's film, came out shortly before the third year survey, and suddenly where people didn't remember in the first year where George Bush was when he learned about 9/11, they all remembered it, or many people remembered it after on the third year, presumably because they had watched the movie. If they hadn't watched the movie, the effect was not as marked. And interestingly, as people get older, the inaccuracy for public memory details declines, whereas as I pointed out before, the memory for personal details does not decline. And I suspect they can, as they get older, because they have various memory problems, they can't take advantage of the externally prompted rehearsal that media coverage allows us to take care of, and hence retain the memories. So all of this suggests that memory for public details is shaped by societal practices and depends on societal practices, but memory for personal details are not, or to a lesser degree. And nevertheless, the level of identification with the relevant group also affects personal details. Now, one question one can ask is, what kinds of memories are really considered important to your identity. And here Clint did a study where basically what I refer to it as a dementia study. So basically he described an individual who was getting old and was slowly becoming demented. And he asked if this individual forgot, if in this case Anna forgot certain memories, would you say that she was beginning to lose her identity as a member of a particular group? Here he tested Black Americans, non-Black Americans, and sports fans, and he looked at their identity as a Black American, as an American, or as an American, or as a sports fan, or non-sports fan. I won't talk about the sports. I'll focus on the Black Americans, white Americans in general. So they learned about that, and then they were asked that Anna would lose her identity, for instance, as a Black American if she forgot something about how she learned about, let's say, 9/11, that is of her flashbulb memory of 9/11, how she watched TV of the coverage of 9/11, and so her mediated witnessing, if you like, her memory for the reception of her flashbulb memory or reception memory, and whether she forgot facts about 9/11, that there were two planes or something like that. And they were asked, to what extent will Anna have lost her identity as, in this case, let's say, a Black American or an American, depending on condition, when she no longer remembered a particular feature, one of these three things. And the events we examined were things like the attack of 9/11, assassination of JFK, Apollo 11, election of Obama, Malcolm X assassination, I Have a Dream speech. Obviously, some are more associated with being a Black American than American in general. And what you find is that you were more likely to feel that Anna had lost her identity as whatever group you were talking about, and it really didn't. The effects were the same across different groups. If she forgot witnessing it through TV or the like, that was the most robust thing. They say listening, witnessing the assassination of Malcolm X through TV coverage of it, witnessing, remembering learning where she was when she learned about the assassination of Malcolm X. That's not quite as robust in terms of loss of identity, but there is still some. And finally, facts without witnessing. If you forgot the facts of something, you were less likely to feel it had much of an impact on your identity as a member of this particular group than if you forgot where you learned about something, or where the actual watching that event unfold, or watching the coverage of that event on TV or some other media form. So the lessons for COVID from all of this is that even though people may feel that the personal memory they experienced as not directly as a direct result of COVID are accurate, they may be in error even if confidently held. So we may have long-lasting vivid memories of our experience of COVID-19, but that doesn't mean we necessarily have accurate memories. And these personal, perhaps erroneous memories will tend to become consolidated over time. That is, you will claim that it's my memory, right or wrong, and I'm sticking with it. And that personal memories will be long-lasting, and they will extend to old age. That is, people remember their personal COVID-19 experience throughout their lifetime. Memory for facts, on the other hand, will also be unreliable, but their preservation will depend on how they are covered in the media over time. If the media stops covering COVID-19 over time, then these memories will fade, unlike our memories for the personal details. That is, they will essentially depend on whether society constructs cultural artifacts to preserve these memories. And even if society does, which they certainly have done with respect to 9/11, for instance, the facts themselves are more likely to be forgotten as one ages. And what about issues of identity? Here, I think it's a little more complicated because it's not clear to me what group we're talking about. When we talk about the extent to which identifying with something matters, it's not clear what we're identifying it with. For instance, it's a global pandemic. It's not something that's relevant to a particular nation. It's relevant to the world in general. However, each nation has dealt with it as a nation. At least that's my impression, and that's certainly true in Europe. And there's a great deal of discussion about whether the EU really stepped up, for instance. But there's also the sort of group of individuals who feel that they are in the center of the pandemic: essential workers, people who were infected or know someone who was infected. And then there's also distinctions between urban and rural, lower and upper class, Black and brown versus white, and so on. So what group you're talking about is not as clear when it comes to something like the COVID-19 pandemic as it is for something like 9/11. What about this other form of memory, where distant memories, where the memory is no longer a lived experience. Memory no longer involves a lived experience, but involves something that happened in the more distant past. Will one generation pass on these memories to the next generation? That is, will there be distant collective communicative memories? And then will society enshrine these memories into long-lasting cultural memories? Let me start with the first question. Will distant communicative memories be formed, which requires intergenerational transmission of these memories? As I said, Osman said that they don't probably last more than 100 years, but I think he was probably a little optimistic. In one study, for instance, where one looked at French-speaking Belgian families, in which the oldest generation was at least 8 at some point during World War II. We probed their memory for the war, specifically asking questions about rationing, bombing, collaboration, and what's called the royal question. I won't go into what the royal question is, but Belgians know what it is. We asked questions about how much they identified as a Belgian, as a Flemish individual, as a French-speaking Belgian, et cetera, et cetera. What we found was that the oldest generation, we asked them both to recall events, specific events related to these topics individually, and then we got them together as a family and asked them to talk about it as a family. The oldest generation talked the most, and the oldest generation's responses were dominated by personally relevant details. That is, they told stories about the experience of the war. One story that sort of sticks in my mind is this one woman said that a German soldier, while she was standing in a rationing line, a German soldier approached her and she was very scared. And it turned out that he really only wanted to flirt with her and that there was no threat, at least in terms of the way that she was viewing threat. Middle generation reports in what they report tend not to have as many personal stories, but still a reasonable number, but now what one would call cultural memories, that is the facts about the event, dominate more. And the youngest generation has the fewest memories of their grandparents' personal experiences coming up. And most of what they have to say are the kinds of things that you would learn in school. And interestingly, the younger people, when they went and then sat around with the family, they tended to repeat the same events as they recalled individually. The middle generation did not have as great a tendency. And presumably that's because the middle generation has a larger repertoire of personal memories about their parents' experience than the younger generation has a large repertoire of their grandparents' personal experience during the war. Interestingly, when you report how did you learn about it, the middle generation is much more likely to say that they learned about it through talking to their grandparents than the younger generation, whereas the younger generation was much more likely to say they learned about it through cultural artifacts. So it appears that historically relevant personal events are transmitted probably just one generation, maybe a little bit for 2 generations, but it doesn't get transmitted very far if what you're depending on is one person talking to the next person, which is personal memories would depend on that. And I should add that this failure to transmit a personal memories is somewhat sad, because I think that when you have a personal memory, if I know what happened to my grandfather during World War II, World War II has a much more personal resonance to me than if I merely read about it in a history textbook. I should say that Belgium may be a special case. It's a very divided country in terms of its identity. And we didn't really look at family interactions, which may have a huge bearing on this. But what are these memories that sort of do make it from one generation to another look like? And here I want to talk a little bit about the 1976 Argentinian coup d'etat. And here we looked at either older people who had lived memories or younger people who have memories of the coup was distant. And we also divided them ideologically into left and right. We asked for a free recall, and then we asked for cued recall about the facts, about causes and consequences of the coup. In terms of the free call, those with lived memories recalled more personal narrative tellings than those with distant memories. That is the way they rendered the event, as we saw with the World War II study, is they rendered it in terms of personal details, not in terms of the facts, the kinds of things that you would learn in school. For distant memories, it was just the opposite. They reported more non-personal narrative. They gave more non-personal narratives. That is, they tended to say the kinds of things that they would learn in school. Interestingly, older individuals with lived memories, that is people who were a little bit older when the coup was taking place, offered much more causal narratives. There were lots more causal connectives, explanations for why one thing followed another, which is interesting to me, at least, because you would think that it's the history textbooks that sort of tell coherent narratives, and you don't form as coherent a narrative while you live through it. In this case, the more coherent narrative, the one that had more causal connective tissue to it, was from people who had lived through it. A little few more details. Those who lived through it that were on the left tended to recall more than any other that students were affected by the coup, and students were affected more by the coup. More of them were killed or disappeared than any other group. And that probably because these leftist lived through individuals were probably students at the time or new students. And those on the left with distant collective memories tended to remember about babies being robbed. I won't go into the details, but it was an issue when we did the survey, was an issue that was very much part of the current discourse. So here it was that the current discourse affected the way people with distant memories remembered the past. And finally, there were a lot of don't know responses among those on the right who did not live through the coup about what's called the flights of death. These were where people who were taken were pushed by the junta, by members of the junta out of planes in order to kill them and dispose of their bodies simultaneously into a river. They tended to say that they didn't know about this, which was, in my mind, a defensive move. And people on the right tended to have actually more effective evaluative remarks than the people on the left, which I found surprising. But that's simply because they tended to have assert a more positive, say how positive things happened because of the coup. Again, probably from a defensive perspective. You didn't see this if you lived through it. You saw it as you reflected back on it. And here, ideology seemed to have more of a preference, a driving force when you reflected into a distant past, as opposed to when you reflected on what you lived through. So lived memories are more likely to be told in terms of personal recollections and simply the facts. So there's some indication that those lived through the event, saw the event in a more contextualized fashion, remembered causes better, even though the cultural artifacts often supply a narrative. And what is recalled is moderated by ideology, not simply that the right tended to view the crew with rose-colored glasses. Uh, uh, these defensive moves were more likely to be seen with distant than lived memories. What about flashbulb memories? I sort of started with flashbulb memories. Are they transmitted across generations? And so here we looked at the transmission of 9/11, flashbulb memories of 9/11, and we had parent-child pairings, and we were interested in the children, what the children knew about their parents' flashbulb memories. None of the children, most of the children were below 4 at the time of 9/11. What their parents' predictions about what their child knew about their flashbulb memories, the children's knowledge of the facts about flashbulb memories, and their knowledge of any personal loss or inconvenience their parents may have experienced. And we looked at relevant factors that we thought might bear on this, like age, how much parents talked to them about 9/11, parents' emotional response at the time of 9/11, personal loss and inconvenience the parents had, and their identity, the children's identity as an American. Basically, some children did not know their parents' flashbulb memory, and it's a glass half empty, half full situation. 11%, you could either think of that as a lot or little, but not every child knew about their parents' flashbulb memories. Of those who claimed that they did, overall consistency was not good. We had a 0-1-2 score, where 2 was you knew a lot of details, 1 you knew vaguely, 0 you didn't know anything. And there was a score of 0.96 out of 2, not very good. And it was a bimodal distribution. Children either knew a lot about their parents' flashbulb memories or they didn't know anything. But even though they could, or when they did report that they knew something, they were not very confident. As for parental predictions, only one parent thought that their child would not know about their flashbulb memories, though 11% reported that they did not know. So parents thought they had conveyed this information to their children, but their children certainly had not picked it up and remembered it. Age seemed to matter. The older you got, the more confident you were in your memories of your parents' parental flashbulb memories. Talk didn't seem to matter much. There was more talk as children got older, and most of the talk was about facts, not flashbulb memories. Emotional experience didn't seem to matter much, nor did media attention seem to matter much. As far as event memories go, children did not know a great deal. They knew about 1/3 of the probes we had for facts, and they were fairly simple facts like how many planes. Age was a factor. How much you talked about the facts, how much the parents talked about the facts was a factor. But media attention was not a factor, how much they attended to things very relevant to 9/11. Interesting, social identity was important. The more children identified as American, the more negative the child's emotional response. The more the child identified as American, the more parents reported talking to their children about the facts about 9/11. The more the child identified, the greater the flashbulb memory correspondence. And there was not a correlation with, these correlations did not appear for event memory. They only appeared for the memory of the parental flashbulb memories. So the results again underscore the importance of social identity, not for the transmission of facts about 9/11. As I said, that's sort of driven in some sense by, at least the other studies suggest, by the way in which the societal practices, but for personal but for the parental personal memories about learning about 9/11. Now, Dick Neisser, a well-known cognitive psychologist, claims that flashbulb memories are important because they allow one to say, I was there. Children's knowledge of their parents' flashbulb memories allow the child to say, my parents was there. In this way, the parent can serve as a witness and the event becomes more resonant for the child. The need for 9/11 to take on this personal character is more important for the child, the assertion would be, the more the child identifies as an American. Lastly, I should say, because I'm running out of time, how much might communicative and cultural memories differ? And here I looked at two events in Argentina. Again, the coup d'etat, and the other is the 2001 Argentinian economic crisis. It was the worst, it was a horrible economic crisis. There were riots on the street. 5 new governments were formed in 1 week. Unemployment went up to 25%. Poverty rate was 55%. GDP dropped 20%. Interestingly, there are a few cultural artifacts built around the economic crisis compared to the coup. The coup has lots of movies about it, lots of books written. It's in all the school textbooks. And there's a commemoration day. There's many memorials. Economic crisis really is not represented in cultural artifacts at all, not mentioned in textbooks. There's no official commemorations, no memorials to speak of. So I'm going to treat the 1976 coup as a cultural memory, if you like, and the 2001 coup as a communicative memory. And we looked at older and younger students, participants. And again, we followed the procedure that Mueller had studied with the coup. And basically, to make the long story short, basically what you find is that when a memory becomes more a cultural memory, it becomes more encrusted in the cultural artifacts. The way in which those who lived through the memory recall the memory versus the way in which the younger generation recalls the memory begins to differ, because the way in which the cultural artifacts tells it doesn't have that personal resonance. When it remains a communicative memory, since the only source about that memory is what the parents say to their child, then the resemblance between what the child knows about the event and what the parent knows about the event is much closer. So as memories become incorporated into the cultural legacy or heritage or cultural memory of a society, they lose that sort of personal resonance. They become distinct from the sui generis way in which an individual tells the story of that historically relevant event, and they take on this more cultural form. So what about COVID-19? Will we remember COVID-19 in a distant form? Now, interestingly, until recently, few people knew about the Spanish flu. There's a very lovely book written by Laura Linney, who on the Spanish flu, and people don't remember it. So for instance, the Spanish flu, that pandemic killed more people than World War I and World War II combined, around 50 to 100 million people. However, when you ask people to list the most important events from the last century, the Spanish flu, despite its devastation, never figures in the top 10 or even the top 20. World War I and World War II are always among the most frequently mentioned events. But this other event, which killed more than the people than those two combined, is not even mentioned. And I don't think Spanish flu is the exception here. Cholera epidemics never make the list when a larger historical period is solicited. Polio is never mentioned when a shorter historical period is listed. To be sure, there's the Black Death that seems to haunt us, but it seems to be an exception rather than the rule. Cultural memories depend on cultural practices and artifacts, and they're usually developed and mentioned through. So why is this the case? Why don't we seem to in our collective imagination about the past, why is it that we don't seem, health crises don't seem to loom large? And I think partially because cultural memories depend on cultural practices and artifacts. They're usually developed and maintained through national efforts. As I stated already, it's not clear that a nation is the container of memory of COVID. It's a global crisis. And moreover, the suffering and death associated with the pandemic seem arbitrary. There's no cause for which one is fighting. There's no sort of identity defining characteristic that sort of justifies these deaths in some way, shape, or form. So in this case, even though the metaphor of war seems to be used all the time in talking about the pandemic, it seems wrong. Death is not identity shaping here, at least at the social or collective level. To be sure, at the collective, individual level, but less at the social or collective level. It's simply an unfortunate consequence of a natural infliction. So the current generation will probably remember personal stories, perhaps inaccurately, but with great confidence. And the facts surrounding the pandemic may be forgotten if not supported by media coverage. And as I just said, I expressed some skepticism about how long this media coverage will last. Intergenerational memory will be limited. Personal stories may be transmitted from one generation, but not much more. And cultural memories will probably not be formed because we will not institute the societal practices that will allow them to be maintained. In other words, I have a very pessimistic conclusion here that the memory for COVID-19 will fade. And this to me is pessimistic and very unfortunate, since it means that we'll be unprepared for the next global pandemic. So thank you very much. And these are all the people that helped me in putting together this talk and the data in therein.
Okay, so thank you very much, Bill, for that comprehensive talk. I've always admired how you can take something as messy as memory and really look at the little processes and mechanisms that go on. But just before I continue the discussion, I just want to remind people to please send in any questions that you might have in the question and answer chat box. So you've touched on a lot of things. So I guess one of the questions I have is one of the things that you mentioned in kind of your last study about the pessimism. And we're probably not going to remember the pandemic as much as a war and things like that. And it kind of got, just because there is a war metaphor going on around this pandemic due to some people's words. How does winners and losers of wars fit in here? Is it, I'm wondering what your thinking is. If we do, the French president used that metaphor, the American president.
Yeah, but I think, it's a war in the sense that society has, marshaled its resources to conquer this virus, and the virus is the enemy. Of course, it's hard to talk about the virus winning or losing in some way, shape, or form in the same way. It doesn't have a memory. It just bops around doing what it's doing. In terms of the way in which people, winners and losers, remember real wars, winners obviously remember them more. They're featured more. They're memorialized more, and they are incorporated into the memories of society more. But even if you're a winner, it really it's usually very nation-centric. So if you contrast the way, for instance, Americans remember World War II and Russians remember World War II, Americans, one of the first things they will mention when they mention World War II will be D-Day, whereas Russians simply never mention D-Day. Americans almost never mention the Battle of Stalingrad, though Russians always mention the Battle of Stalingrad. And historians will tell you the Battle of Stalingrad was much more important in terms of winning the war than D-Day. D-Day, you could say, was a sort of mopping up exercise toward the end of the war. And even in terms of death, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 soldiers, Allied soldiers, were killed on D-Day. In one day during the Battle of Stalingrad, through the bombing by the Germans, 40,000 Russian citizens were killed. So the difference is just monstrous. And so, but it doesn't register in the American memory. And it's because of the cultural supports. And and I think societies don't really build many cultural practices, societal practices around health crises, because they really don't bear, even though we use the war metaphor, they don't bear on our French collective memory or Spanish collective memory or American collective memory. They're just something that we have to get through. And so I'm very skeptical that, just like the Spanish flu, I mean, I knew nothing about the Spanish flu until this started. It's just not part of what society practices, because it's not something that really bears on our identity in any way, shape, or form. And the deaths with respect to COVID-19 have been horrible, but they're not deaths. It's not like a soldier dying for America or a soldier dying for France. It's a person dying because they got this horrible virus and they died. They didn't die for anything. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why we find it even more tragic, if you like, because it seems so meaningless. And so in so many ways it differs. And so we want to commemorate those people who died societally, if their death has a meaning for society. Of course, the individual, family, and the like will commemorate the death of the individual at the individual level, but not at the societal level. And you need that societal practices in order to get something to sort of last beyond 1 or 2 generations, which, as I illustrated, communicative memories don't last for very long.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was just thinking with COVID, it's sort of like a narcissistic blow to humans, to be so powerless. Like, we've lost the battle against COVID, and lots of people died. And why would you commemorate that?
Oh, well, Germany and Japan commemorates the soldiers that died for them. So simply because you lose a battle, I don't think you still have a responsibility. And the individuals who died of it, their family still commemorates them. So I mean, there are things which we turn our backs to occasionally, but we usually do this because of some societal purpose. I mean, but Germany and Japan they may call upon people to fight in the future. And if they turn their back upon people they called on to fight in the past, then that would not serve their larger purpose, if you like.
Yeah, because usually the communities that put money into cultural memories are governmental, national, state, provincial, and so what's kind of the value added to preserve that memory of COVID?
Right, and their community. You can have vernacular memories which are sometimes preserved just through communicative memories. So Lithuanians of Lithuanian descent have very clear memories of Lithuanian national holidays, even when they were under the thumb of the Soviet Union. They didn't learn it in school. They didn't learn it through societal practices because the Soviet Union wouldn't let them. They learned it through conversations. And you can see certain strong communicative groups will really allow these memories to go on from generation to generation. But health crises don't seem to be of that kind. And I think it's because there isn't, I mean, what social group do you glom onto? I mean, Lithuanians glom on to being the oppressed Lithuanians. The Basques glom on to
what about a monument to capitalism that we weren't prepared for the pandemic? Maybe we don't really want to remember that.
Yeah, and it's who's the we?
Yeah, exactly. That's the question. Yeah. Do you think, you started your talk talking about some of the flashbulb memories, and, I know a lot of your work, you've looked at, memories of living through war experiences. Do you kind of see COVID as more like a long extended kind of, I'm going to use the word traumatic experience, or do you see it, more as, oh, this is when I found out that, COVID arrived and I had confinement? I guess I'm kind of asking, do you see the length of the time shifting thing?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I've thought about it and I have no clear answer.
Yeah, okay.
Even though it is something that we collectively have experienced over an extended period of time, it varies.
Yeah.
We know that the African American community in the US has experienced it in a much greater degree than the white community. We know that people with certain resources can escape to their country houses, whereas other people are stuck in the city. My brother lives in Montana, in his particular county, which is has the same, it's about the same size as, the county is about the same size as Connecticut. And they have had 0 cases.
Right.
So there's a rural urban divide. There's all of these divides. So, how that affects how one is going to remember it, because the level, the level of trauma which one has experienced is differs.
Yeah. I think you're right. Some of the urban-rural divides and the ethnic divides will probably be quite defining here.
I think so.
Yeah.
And then there's the essential workers and the non-essential workers. The essential workers are experiencing it in a very different way.
Yeah, no, that's
non-essential workers.
Okay, so we have a comment question from Jens here, so I'm just going to read it aloud.
Yes.
Good to see you, Bill. And
that's
thank
nice.
you.
Good to hear that you have a comment, Jens.
And thank you for an, as always, rich and stimulating talk. Just one short question and what might seem to be a technical detail. You mentioned the category of lived memories, which are often more long-term remembered than mediated memories. How does the interpretation of lived memories in the moment of the remembered events impact on their quality?
So first, when I say lived memories, I do not mean necessarily directly experienced memories. I think that most of our lived collective memories are experienced through some mediated form. So I did not directly experience 9/11 in the sense that I was not at ground zero at the Pentagon or whatever, or on one of those planes. So it's not a direct experience. And when we talk about trauma, for instance, you directly experience the trauma.
Right.
You either are attacked or you experience someone directly. You see it with your eyes, this happening. So all of it's in a mediated form in some way, shape, or form, which is why I want to emphasize that the lived memories have to not just be something that happens that you hear about, but it also has to impact on your identity in some way, shape, or form. So they're vicarious memories, to use David Pillamer's notion, but they're vicarious memories that impact your identity. So I may know about some volcano that erupts in Indonesia, but it doesn't really impact my identity much, and I quickly forget it. So it's this identity bearing aspect that really, really has a huge implication on how well we retain it. And flashbulb memories, you seem to have this extreme level of confidence. And here, even Clint found it when he looked at hockey events. And you may think hockey events are stupid things, but for a hockey fan,
hockey events are stupid.
More important than anything. I tell a nice Canadian that. But there, it was important how much you identified as a hockey fan and as a hockey fan of a particular team. So again, your ability to retain these things has a great, great deal to do with the way in which they impact your identity. So identity formation is at the core of this, and identity reinforcement.
Well, thanks for that answer, Bill. I'm not sure if you answered Jens's question because he has more.
Okay, what was it? Tell me.
Okay.
I forgot. I got so wrapped up with identity, I couldn't remember the rest.
You may have answered already, but I'll just read it out. Interpretation is a crucial form of meaning making.
Yeah.
How do the meanings people give to a memorized event shape its memory? How would we study the interrelation between memories and meaning within that cultural and social picture of remembering that you have suggested?
Yeah. So, I mean, Jens, it's fair for Jens to say that I don't really look at interpretation in any dense way, in that I don't take the narrative that somebody has and give the kind of detailed analysis that Jens would give to it. The questions I ask have more to do with retention, how much of this memory still is present in and easily accessible, how much it's there for you, and how much it continues to shape who you think you are. I don't ask, I would think it would be a lovely question to ask, but maybe I'm just too lazy to ask it. What it is, how that the content of that gives shape to your identity. I merely say, does it give shape to your identity, and then sort of stop there. And the question about interpretation is really about the way in which that memory gives shape to your identity. And there's a little bit of it there, but probably not as much as Jens would like.
Okay, thanks, Bill. I just want to follow up on something you were mentioning, the coup, and you kind of mentioned that people that were on the right wing, they said they didn't remember things, and then you threw in something, they remembered more, or I'm probably paraphrasing it, but the gist was they were less likely to remember stuff from the past, and you
Yeah.
talked about defensive moves.
Yes. So basically, so for instance, the example I gave was uh, they were asked about the flight of death, where um, uh, individuals who were taken by the junta were put on planes. They were flown over a river and pushed off the planes, therefore both killing them and disposing of the body in one fell efficient swoop. And uh, they said, "Oh, I don't remember that. I don't know anything about that." Whereas it's like one of the most prominent features in the sort of standard narrative of the coup. I mean, because it's such a horrifying uh, action. I have no idea if they really didn't know about it,
Right.
but they refused to engage in it. And so there, and here that was not true of the people who had lived through it. If you
Mm.
had lived through it, you were much more willing to engage in that discussion. It
Oh,
was
I see.
people who were on the right,
Mhm.
who now it was a distant memory. So they had to make the coup seem not as bad because they somehow, their ideology was associated with it.
I
Uh,
see. Okay.
and so, um, uh, I mean, it's the same way um, when Americans, for instance, turn back to the earlier American first sort of Charles Lindberghish type
Mhm.
isolationist sort of perspective, which was filled with anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
They just don't want to acknowledge the anti-Semitism. They will say, "Oh, I don't know anything about that,"
Right.
because it creates a conflict that, which is why I called it a defensive move, creates a conflict that they would rather not have, I
I'm
think.
kind of wondering if a researcher came that was clearly identified with the right, how things would change, and if they would
Good
change.
question.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
the people that did the interviews were not identified with the right.
yeah, yeah. I
Uh,
just want to switch around now to another question I have. I find it really interesting. Um, Maybe more on a qualitative level. How did, like, what did parents say to their children about 9/11? Do you remember any off the top of your head? Because I'm just kind of thinking, if one had children or grandchildren that weren't around during this COVID, like, what's the nature of the talk? Is it very factual
it tends
or,
to be more factual.
yeah,
This is what happened.
right.
Um, it more so than this is the way I experienced it, but they still talk about the way I experienced it. I mean, we did have not, though it would be interesting to do,
Uh-huh.
gotten parents and children together and asked them to talk about it.
Mm,
We did with the Belgian World War II, which
right.
is a more distant thing, but we haven't for 9/11. But that would be interesting to do.
Was there a lot of emotion in those memories when they, do you have any sense? I'm just very curious.
Oh, um, uh, th- they tended to, if you identified as an American, the child tended to remember the emotions as greater, have a
Right.
more stronger
Okay.
emotional reaction to it.
Right.
But um, in terms of the parents, I don't know. The real answer is it was a survey that we did, so I
Right.
I I don't have that level of detail.
Yeah, you need Jens on your team.
I need Jens on my team to make collect all this copious detailed narratives. Yeah.
Yeah, because I no, it's very interesting to think about how one would talk about COVID and perhaps confinement to children, and how this might play out in their memories, whether it's more factual or, do parents use more or less emotion around that? And like you said, if there's not a strong social identity component, you know,
Yes.
what's
So
the glue that
so
binds it? Yeah.
so I mean, if you think about it, I mean, so I didn't have in the Belgium studies, I didn't have very many children grandchildren
Right.
knowing much about their grandparents World War II experience. An interesting study I didn't have time to go over. We looked at French families which had in which the grandparent was either in the resistance
Hmm.
or was a collaborator,
Right.
and during World War II. And if they were in the resistance, the grandchildren tended to know more than if they were in the collaboration.
Hmm.
On the other hand, when you looked at Flemish families, and here we're just finishing this up,
Hmm.
but our impression is when you look at Flemish families, you don't see this difference. And it's partially because there isn't as much stigma within the Flemish families of being part of the collaboration than there is among the French-speaking Belgian families.
Right.
And so a lot of it has to do with what is the children are going to ask about,
Hmm.
and a lot of it has to do with the way in which the parents feel comfortable talking about it.
Right. And perhaps the kind of the cultural mix and as well the cultural memories perhaps inform that whole.
Yeah, well, yes. And, one of the things about COVID-19 is if it's not taught in school, if it's not, why would the grandchild ever ask you, what was it like to be socially isolated for 3 months?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it really interesting just that 100 year, and you're arguing it's a little less, but it was almost 100 years of the last global pandemic,
Right. Yes. Right.
1918. And I think many of us don't, have heard of it, but there's no memory. There's
No, I
like it
mean,
was
I
bad,
think
but okay.
because
Yeah,
it fades within one generation.
right.
I'm actually part of a Czech team that's looking at um, anti-vaccine attitudes,
Hmm.
and they look at when what people's attitudes toward the vaccination, and when the vaccination was introduced,
Right.
and particularly when the problem arose. So, like when smallpox was prevalent, or when polio was prevalent, and the like. And what they find is that anti-vaccination attitudes toward this particular vaccine for this particular disease
Hmm.
is pretty non-existent for about 20 years. And after about 20 years, you begin to see resistance to this particular vaccination
Hmm.
develop.
Hmm.
And that would fit into a generation. That is
Yeah.
when the generation shifts and you no longer have these, what I call lived memories,
Yes.
then suddenly you have the luxury of thinking this is no big deal and I'm against this vaccine.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And so this generation, this short period of time, things fade. And unless culture comes in, social practices come in and preserve that memory, it's going to fade. And in order for social practices to come in, you have to have an institution, an entity to form and maintain these cultural practices. And I think one of the reasons why health crises fade so quickly is because they're not really relevant to establishing an identity for any of these institutions or cultural practices.
Okay. Just one last question. Do you think we should have cultural memory of COVID-19 in 50 years or 100 years?
I think if we had a very prevalent memory of the Spanish flu, we might have been better prepared.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that China was a little bit more better prepared with respect to the
Mhm.
COVID-19 than
Mm.
Europe and the United States, is because they had a better memory of SARS.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So uh, I think it behooves us.
Yes.
And whether I think it behooves us or not, I still have this rather pessimistic view that it's not going to happen.
Right. Yeah, that seems to be a theme of this conference of kind of cynical pessimism and kind of optimism and moving
Put a
forward.
bunch of academics around and you're not going to get only get criticism, cynicism, and pessimism.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for your really thoughtful talk and really looking at the landscape of all types of memories of events and how we might think about COVID-19 and the memory processes around that. And I also want to thank Kira Winter for her help behind the scenes organizing things. And thank you once again to the
And
attendees
thank
for
you
coming.
for organizing this and inviting me.
You're welcome.
Okay,
On behalf of the
bye-bye.
board.
Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.